Week 9 of the fantasy football season, and his running back sits this week. The first start's DeAndre Swift of the Philadelphia Eagles. So DeAndre Swift, it's been a solid season for him, no doubt about it, for this Eagle team. But I know the last few weeks, the numbers have dropped off a little bit. They've been passing the football a little bit more. Is Philadelphia, and obviously A.J. Brown with 125-plus yards receiving each and every game, breaking the NFL record the last 6 weeks. But right now, this week in a grinded-out division matchup, big game, no doubt about it, with the Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles. I think DeAndre Swift in this one's going to get a lot of touches, and it's going to be a little bit tougher to pass on this Cowboy team, where we know they got good ball hawking corners like Stephon Gilmore and Bland, who's been great for this Cowboy team since filling in for Trevion Diggs. But anyway, I think Swift, he has a decent ball game versus the Cowboys. They're middle-of-the-pack type of team versus the run. If there's one weakness in this defense, it is versus the run. The next start, Darrell Henderson, Los Angeles Rams. So Henderson, he didn't play all season and then signed him up 2 weeks ago after Kyren Williams and Ronnie Rivers went on IR. And this week, a pretty good matchup with the Packers that give up the third most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So Henderson, so far, the first 2 games, he's been the starter and getting majority of the touches between him and Royce Freeman. And he's had 13.5 fantasy points and then 11 in last week's game versus the Dallas Cowboys. So this week here in a pretty decent matchup, like I mentioned, at the Green Bay Packers, even though Matthew Stafford possibly could be out of this game with the thumb injury and might go on IR. Darrell Henderson's definitely a start this week as a solid number 2 running back with teams back on buys, and it's pretty thin at the position with the injuries and the bye weeks. Next starts Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Rachaad White finally had a bounce-back game in last week's game on Thursday Night Football versus the Buffalo Bills, where he went over 15 fantasy points in PPR league. So we know he's one of the better receiving backs out of the backfield. Last season, 50 catches in his rookie year. Now he's starting to catch the ball a lot. I know he's not running great in between the tackles, only over a little bit, 3.5 yards per carry. But in terms of catching the football and making men miss and putting up decent fantasy points, Rachaad White in the passing game definitely doing it. And this week here on the fast turf indoors at the Houston Texans, I think once again he has a solid one. Next starts Kareem Hunt of the Cleveland Browns. So Kareem Hunt looks like he might be the man back there in the backfield. He didn't have the greatest of games, was Hunt versus the Seattle Seahawks, but he had the goal line touchdown. He had 14 carries. I know Jerome Ford isn't 100%, but Pierre Strong still got work as well. But Kareem Hunt's still working his way into football shape, I believe, here. Hunt, obviously, he sat out the first month of the season. So, unfortunately, Nick Chubb was out for the season with the knee injury. But anyway, Kareem Hunt, good matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals. We just saw Gus Edwards torch him for 3 touchdowns on the ground in that game. And this week here, I like him as a start. Next start's James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. So James Cook's been a solid running back this season, a perfect number 2 back to put in your starting lineup. I know last week only 8.30 fantasy points for Cook because Josh Allen was throwing the ball all over the yard to Stephon Diggs and obviously Gabe Davis, who had a big bounce-back game. But anyway, I think in this one, it's going to be grinded-out type of game. Cincinnati, they're running hot right now, winning 3 games in a row. And this team, they're going to have to rely on the run game a little bit more. Josh Allen, we know, is not 100% with the shoulder and just other injuries is what he's dealing with. So this one, in a game that's going to be a potential shootout between 2 of the AFC top teams, them and the Kansas City Chiefs. I think this week here, James Cook has a good game, and he's a start. Ramondre Stevenson, a start as well for me. I know last week it was a down game for Stevenson and this Patriot team, in a game where they had to play catch-up early and often at the Miami Dolphins. But Stevenson now, with Kendrick Moore now for the season with a torn ACL, I think more in the passing game, he's going to be involved. A lot of bubble screens, a lot of even lining him up a little bit on the outside and running routes because this team's decimated a wide receiver. We knew coming into the year and the whole season they didn't have a true number 1, but now with Kendrick Bourne, who pretty much was like their number 1 receiver this season in terms of putting up fantasy points, touchdowns, and receptions. Now I think Stevenson's going to play more into the passing game. And this week here in a matchup versus a Commander defense where they really haven't stopped anyone over the last few weeks, Stevenson is a solid start this week. And the final starts Josh Jacobs of the Vegas Raiders. So Josh Jacobs, I know it's been an up-and-down season here for him, but this Raider team, the offense is intact now. Jacobs, he's catching the ball pretty well out of the backfield. And he's another guy who really didn't have a training camp at all, reporting a week before, 2 weeks before, at most, before the season started, is Jacobs. So maybe he'll get his legs under him. This Raider team, I think, has to run the football a little bit more. I know they're getting down early and often in games of late here, but Josh Jacobs is still a decent running back. And with a lot of teams on bye, or look at the position here, it's very weak. So Jacobs is a start this week. Now to the sit, Dameon Pierce. Now to the sit, Dameon Pierce of the Houston Texans. So Dameon Pierce, it looks like it's a 50-50 split over there with Pierce and Singletary. Pierce hasn't found the end zone really at all this season. 2 touchdowns. He's not catching the ball out of the backfield, strictly just running it. And he's only getting minimum results. So right now in a matchup versus a tough Tampa Bay defense that's pretty solid versus the run this season, and him splitting, there's no reason I have confidence in putting Dameon Pierce in my starting lineup, even with all these teams on bye and just the position not being great this season. Next, it's D'Onta Foreman of the Chicago Bears. So D'Onta Foreman, if his team's in the game and it's close, or if they're winning enough, he's going to put up numbers. But this game here for the New Orleans Saints could be the same script as it was on Sunday Night Football at the Chargers, where they were down early and often, and they had to abandon the run and bring in their third down backs in there, Ariat Evans and Roschon Johnson. So this week here in a matchup, the only reason I don't like Foreman, really, this game could be out of hand early and often. They're going to be trailing to New Orleans, and that's when Johnson and Evans then will come in at the position, because we know Foreman's not really a receiving back out of the backfield. So right now, hopefully the game script goes the other way, but I don't see Foreman doing much in this game. Once again, next hits Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the last 2 weeks, I'll give credit to Harris. He put up 15 fantasy points in that Week 7 game. And then Week 8, he had 10 fantasy points in the losing effort versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. But this week here, tough matchup versus the Tennessee Titans on Thursday Night Football, where they're one of the best teams on defense versus the run, where pretty much running backs haven't had much success this season, where you could pass on this Titan team, but you just can't run the football. And I know it's most likely going to be Mitchell Trubisky starting at quarterback after Kenny Pickett left the game with the arm injury. But anyway, Najee Harris, he's been a tough running back to own this season. His ceiling's pretty much 12, 15 points at most. And this week with a tough matchup and a short week, I have him as a sit. The next sit, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. I know Hubbard, he started the game, and Miles Sanders had the old goose egg last week's ball game for the Panthers versus the Houston Texans. And this week, the Indianapolis Colts come to town versus Carolina Panther team. I know Hubbard's a decent receiver out of the backfield, but he didn't do anything as well in last week's game versus the Texans. So this week here versus a pretty solid defense in the Indianapolis Colts, I don't know if I could trust Hubbard as a running back that could go out there and put up fantasy points for fantasy owners. So right now with a tough matchup and just in a pretty bad offense over there for this Carolina team, even though he's going to get majority of the touches possibly again, he's a sit. Tony Pollard, he's a sit for me. I know Tony Pollard's been a first, second round pick in most fantasy leagues, but the numbers each and every week have went down from week 1 to week 5. Then week 6, he had a little bit of a spike versus the Chargers with a big receiving game in that one. And then in a blowout victory versus the Rams in week 8, 43-20, Tony Pollard, he didn't factor into anything in that ball game. Pretty much non-existent with a pedestrian 7 fantasy points in PPR league. So this week here, tough matchup at the Philadelphia Eagles, one of the best teams in the league versus the run. And I know this Cowboy team, they're going to want to take their time in this game. They want to establish the run and work off of play action. But I just don't see Tony Pollard doing much in between the tackles in this game. And even in the receiving game this season, we really haven't seen much out of Tony Pollard. So I know most people are going to go out there and play him, but in terms of putting up fantasy points and being really productive, I don't see it for Tony Pollard this week. And he's a sit. Next sit, Amari DiMercido of the Arizona Cardinals. So DiMercido, he's filled in pretty well in my opinion for James Conner. And right now, Conner possibly could be back this week or the next week here for this Arizona Cardinal team. But I don't see the Cardinals rushing him back into the lineup, where this Cardinal team's out of it, obviously. One of the worst teams in the league with only 1 win. So this week here, tough matchup at the Cleveland Browns. We know this Brown front line's a solid line. Kenneth Walker, they held him in check in the second half of that game in week 8, even though it was a tough loss at the end of the game for this Brown team. But right now, if the Browns get off to an early start and they got to play catch-up as this Arizona team, I don't know if DiMercido is going to be much of a factor in this one. And the final running back I look to bench this week's A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. So A.J. Dillon, he's had some decent weeks over the last few weeks, and him and Aaron Jones, for the most part, have been splitting carries in the backfield. But this week here, pretty tough matchup versus the Rams, who have a pretty solid front line and have been pretty decent versus the run. Like I mentioned, Tony Pollard early in the video, he didn't do much versus Ram defense, where the Cowboys threw all over this Ram team but just couldn't run the football. And right now with Jordan Love struggling in teams, pretty much stacking the box and forcing Love to beat him, it's going to be another tough day on the ground, I think, here for A.J. Dillon and this Packer team. He needs to sit this week, so that's running back start sits for week 9 of the fantasy football season.